Hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Welcome to Live with Dan on this Friday. I have an exciting show with Karine Pepin coming up, but first I want to key you in on a few things that are happening here at Question Pro. So next week we have a brand tracking webinar with Patrick and Patrick Jones and Crystal Weiss, and they'll be talking about brand tracking and how you can't just leave it up to a magic 8 ball. So I'll leave it at that. We'll put the link into the comments here, and then you can check it out and register. It should be a very interesting webinar around brand tracking there. So that's something to check out. And then I think without further ado, I will bring in our guest today. And as I mentioned, Karine Pepin, she is the head of Quant at 2CV Research and also leads the US office there. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, I've been wanting to have you on the show. We were talking about this beforehand for a long time because of your background. I love your LinkedIn post. That's primarily how, I got to know who you are and so forth. But I also read, this Green Book article recently around, around data quality and so forth. And as I was reading the article, and we'll put the link to the Green Book article here in the comments. I thought a good way to kick it off would be, you said something in there that really intrigued me actually, and you said kind of reframing the way you define data. Like, what if we defined data quality based on what it is rather than what it's not? Can you kind of dive into that and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time cleaning data. I don't know if you've seen that LinkedIn post, but
Yep.
we never really quantify how much time is lost in the entire ecosystem just cleaning data. So I
Right.
know I spent 250 hours last year.
Wow.
Yeah, I know it sounds crazy. It kind of is, but when you get sucked into it, you just can't get out. It's so I've thought a lot about what it is, philosophically, and the difference between when we were cleaning data 10 years ago and when we're cleaning data today. And I think that if we think back to how things were before, we were just dealing with an inattentive respondents. So, they were primary speeders, straight liners. We did our due diligence, we removed them. But at the end of the day, that really did not change the big picture so much because the baseline was good. Like, we had well-managed double opt-in panel.
Yep.
Most people were good. You're just removing a handful of people and you're like, we're good, But the fraud has evolved a lot. And I think these legacy checks, I guess what I call them, they don't necessarily work anymore. And I love the example of a speeder because that's probably the most common thing that people put in their survey. They have a speeder check, right?
Yep.
But what's happening with the speeder check is that we have people who read fast and they're fine, right? But we kick them out. And then we have people that are slow and are really problematic and we keep them in. Okay,
Right.
because we know that the fraudsters are actually slower because they know the game. They're not going to get caught for speeding, but also they might be translating the pages as they're doing the survey. They might be taking multiple surveys at the same time and they go slower. So then we end up keeping bad people, removing good people, and we're actually making things worse, right? And I think the ultimate test is if you're presenting your data to a client and it doesn't make any sense, and you just say, well, I removed the speeders, well, that's a poor defense. Your data still doesn't make sense. So good data is not the absence of speeders. So it must be something else, right? And this is kind of what I've been trying to answer for myself so that we minimize these bad decisions that we make when you clean the data.
Got it. I think it makes sense in terms of I like your analogy, back in the day, it was you just had to worry about problematic, maybe one person in the survey or, kind of taking the survey and clean those folks out. But now with anything, it's become obviously more sophisticated, and as quick as data quality tools catch up, the fraudsters or, bots, whatever you want to call them, are also catching up and they're trying to game the system. So it's a really kind of unique kind of push and pull that I think we have in the industry today. So what are some good techniques that you've seen, Karen, in terms of, data quality and finding those people that are, maybe taking multiple surveys at a time or using, bots and things? Are there any particular methods that you've seen work really well?
Well, I guess I'm just gonna say first thing, you need a fraud detection software. Like I'm not
Hmm.
saying like you need that. That's like a hygiene factor.
Yeah.
But despite that, you still have some work to do, like because there are some people that will fall through the cracks. And I
Hmm.
think one of the mistakes that we're making is that we're looking at data quality in aggregate. So we're like, oh, okay,
Mm.
my total 80% of people use streaming service at home, therefore my data must be good because that makes sense. But
Mm.
when we do this, we lose sight of like the consistency at a respondent level. Okay. And what I mean by that is that if you've seen bad data before,
Hmm.
you know that people are not going to be consistent throughout the survey. Like it's
Mm.
impossible if you're not reading, if you're a fraudster, that
Hmm.
question number one would be in line with question number 30. Like people are
Yep.
not going to be consistent for 20 minutes. Okay.
Hmm.
So even if your data makes sense in total, like one day your client might say, oh, I want to see this by student. And you're like, sure. So you cut your data by student and then you're like,
Hmm.
oh, well, this doesn't make sense. Like the whole thing just fell apart here. And you start digging a little deeper and you realize, well, the students are not really students because they should be making less money and they're not. They should not be
Mm.
working full time and they are. And then
Hmm.
you're realizing, well, that's actually what data quality is. Okay. What data quality is that when the story of each person makes sense, when like
Mm.
that is cohesive. And the only way to do this is like you go row by row in your data set and you start
Hmm.
psychoanalyzing everyone, and
Hmm.
that's not scalable. Like you
Right.
don't want to be doing this, okay?
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but that is essentially what it is when
Hmm.
the persona of each person makes sense, for a whole 25-minute long survey. And then
Hmm.
you'll see like it's interesting because I think we're still under this assumption that bad data is like this crazy things, like people are having 22 kids and like there's all these outliers. But actually bad data can also just be flat. Like bad
Hmm.
data is
Hmm.
data where nothing over index, and you cannot run a segmentation on something like this. Like it's
Right.
impossible. There are no
Right.
patterns in the data. And
Right.
this is where we need to focus our energy on when we define data quality.
Got it. So more on an individual respondent level and making sure that that person's answers are lining up to, reality, honestly, right? So I, I
Mm-hmm.
think I think that makes
Yeah.
sense. And then is that I think, also in the Green Book article you kind of mentioned around, beautiful data. Is that sort of what you mean by that? Or what do you mean by beautiful data and what makes data beautiful? Because I think a lot of
Yeah.
people that aren't quant, focused will look at them like I just get anxiety, or this doesn't look, this is beautiful. What? It's not a pretty picture or anything. So, what do you mean by that? I'm on your camp. I love looking at
Yeah.
data, and I think it's cool, and but beautiful is an interesting, I think, word to use there. So, can you kind of dive into that a little bit?
Well, maybe it's aspirational, like is good
Okay.
good enough? I don't know.
Yeah.
But when I look at a data set and everything lines up and everything is beautiful and like it's so bulletproof that no matter what cut you're asked, you cut the data by whatever and it still makes sense. Like that's
Mm.
what beautiful is.
Hmm.
It's just if you think of some product, I don't know, like maybe thinking about it as a product instead of as a data set is better, but it's
Hmm.
like every corner of it is well done.
Right. Right.
The color, the style,
Hmm.
everything about it. And to me that's this cohesion at a respondent level.
Got it. Got it. I mean, that's a good analogy because I often, sometimes I'll cut data and I'll look at it like, well, this looks ugly, but I don't think about like the inverse of that, like, well, no, but all the other stuff is beautiful, so I
Yeah.
like that. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And then, so you kind of maybe, touched on this a little bit on the respondent level, but what do you think that we need to truly achieve, good data quality? Is it some of the things you mentioned, or are there other things that you think would be good to include here in terms of achieving that, good data quality?
Well, I think we definitely don't need more QA traps. Like
Mm.
we're good. I
Yeah.
think what we need is more effective QA traps. Okay. And
Got it.
I
Yeah.
think what I mean by that is that I don't know how effective, like, select very likely, select blue, how many marbles does John have? Like, I don't
Hmm.
know how effective these things are really are. I think we
Right.
need to be a lot more subtle with these QA checks. And we also need them to be more dimensional, like multi-dimensional, as opposed to here's a question, that's the trap, you know. So they kind of go together. But I think like ultimately, it's a problem that is very difficult to fix in the back end. You know, we need to think about making that investment in actually sample sources. You know, we need to go back to this model where most people were like had good intent taking surveys. And it's like by having more verified sample, you know, like expert networks, for example, like how do you scale this for consumer? That's the tough part, because like obviously if you have a consumer sample, you can't afford spending $200 per respondent and having their LinkedIn profile verified and everything. But how do we scale this is going to be the challenge. But I think like there's no amount of like salt or sugar that is going to make a dish taste good if it's made with bad ingredients. Like, you know, there's no amount of voodoo magic in the back end that you can do. You know, you just have to invest in sample.
Right. I think it makes sense. It's not like, you know, the waiting data can't be you're always, you know, the salt and sugar that you put into it. Like sometimes it's not good. So
yeah, exactly. You can't like weight somebody by like 20 times, right? Because you couldn't find, you know, the needle in the haystack, and like, no problem, let's weight this. And then like one person is now 20 people. Like you can't do that.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And I really like what you're saying about data quality, because it's one thing to keep obviously the fraudsters and the bots out of it, but it's another thing to truly collect good quality data from, you know, the average respondent that's truthfully taking a survey, right? And then how do you kind of, you know, do that? And I think that's a lot of what you're saying in terms of, you know, having these different things in place just to collect data from the person that is truthful and just wants to answer the survey, and making sure that you're getting that good quality data. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you might think like I'm setting the bar too high, but actually no, because if you think about it, like if you start out with an honest person who reads question and is truthful, like that's just kind of the baseline. I don't think that's like setting the bar so high.
Yeah. I mean, that should be the bar, not the high bar. That should be the low bar, right? So awesome. Well, I wanted, you know, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, you know, ChatGPT, generative AI. Obviously, you know, what I think is always fascinating about this piece of tech, I'll call it, is that, you know, largely it's 6-7 months old, and yet it's just really taken hold quite a bit on the industry. And you've, you know, kind of early adopter in a lot of these things, but what fascinates you the most around, you know, ChatGPT, generative AI, and that technology?
Well, I think what I was most excited about is the ability to understand context, which seemed really new. And then the other thing is like just how accessible it is, you know, because, you know, AI has been around obviously for a long time, but like it's sort of democratized the use of it, and you can have a use case and you can try it out yourself. So that was pretty cool to me when I started using it.
Yeah. And I think I like what you said, democratizing the use of it, because it always did seem like AI was something out here that only developers could get their hands on. And then I think with ChatGPT coming on board, it was like, no, I mean, the average person can play around with it and get the insights that they need. So I love that. And then one of your, you know, posts I want to go back to is around, you know, you were kind of early adopter, I would say, in terms of using some of the tech and the API to plug it into, I think it was a Google Sheet or maybe it was an Excel, and then, you know, using it to code open-ended responses. So can you talk a little bit about that? And then did it work? Did it not work? And what was sort of your summary there?
Yeah, so I did 2 experiments. The first one was coding. I started with the hardest one. I don't know why I did that. So, you know, when you play around with ChatGPT, you know, there's a lot of people that say, oh, it's great at summarizing text and everything. But there are 2 main limitations with ChatGPT. One is you can't scale this. You know, you can't go like in your chat window, one respondent case at the time, and then like that's not scalable with a data set that has 1,000. And then the other thing is you can't really train it. And if you can't train the model, it doesn't get smarter. So it will never be like as good as we need it, like for real work.
Right.
So that's why I worked with a developer to set something up with the API where, you have a spreadsheet that looks like, your data set row by row, and then you can get things done there. And I'm not an engineer, so I'm more like the product manager in this situation where I have a problem and I know what I want it to do,
Right.
but I got someone to do the coding in the back. So the coding experiment was really interesting because I played with it for about a day. I provided a code frame and open ends that I had already coded myself, maybe like 50 of them. And then you're like, okay, run the formula and do the rest of the coding for me. And I realized actually how coding is hard. Like coding is a really difficult task. Coding is not just like dumping a bunch of text and be like, summarize this for me. Because it has to be done at a respondent level. It has to have the granularity, and it has to be consistent across the respondents because you're quantifying this.
Yep.
So I did not get there. I mean, it worked, but just not to a point where it was accurate enough for me and consistent enough. And then this is why I realized, well, there are companies who do this. Like, there's a reason. Like, this is actually a very difficult use case. And there are companies that are based on AI doing this, and they've been around for years. And there's also humans doing this. And I have a lot of respect for humans now that I've actually tried to train this thing to do the same thing that humans do. And like, clearly, there's probably better people to do this than me. But so I mean, the conclusion is that I'm still going to outsource coding. This was not worth my time. But what was worth my time was actually the second experiment, because that was using it to assess the quality of open-ended responses. So,
interesting.
As I've mentioned, that's, I spend a lot of time checking data, and reading open-ended responses is a huge time suck. And there's like nothing that does it for you. Well, there's something now, but not when I did the experiment. So the tools that were available to us were through fraud detection software, for example. And they can pick up on things like gibberish and profanity and cut and paste and that sort of things, but not so much relevance of the content. Like, does this actually answer the question? So when I started playing around with ChatGPT, I thought, oh, well, this is really cool because it understands context. So it should tell me if this is answering the question or not answering the question. So using the same sort of process, Google Sheet, the coding here is actually coding, but it's much simpler, right? Because you just want a yes or no. And if you get fancy, then you can also ask for a reason for rejection. It's gibberish, or it's not relevant, or it's a different language. So this worked really well. What I found, though, is that, so in my training data, my first sort of batch was, I had really good open ends that I said they're good. I had really bad ones that I said they're bad. But what I realized is that the model was just being too strict. It was just rejecting too many people because my training data was too good. Like, I really picked the best open end. So, GPT is like, well, this is not as good as this one. Bye. So I'm like, okay, well, I can't kick out 60% of my data set. So I'm just going to have to dumb this down a little bit. So then I added bad responses. I mean, not bad, but like just not as like nicely expressed. And then that kind of evened things out. So this is actually really useful. So what I do is usually we agree on the good ones, no problem. But sometimes, like, I tend to be a bit more lenient with the bad ones. So I will review the bad ones before I just like completely remove people. But this has really been like something that makes my work more efficient.
Yeah, no, I think that's great in terms of, first of all, I'll agree with you that coding is difficult, and it's even difficult for humans. And I'm sure that it's difficult to train any sort of AI models to do that. And then second, I love that you're using it to check like data quality of the open ends, and like, does it make sense? Because manually going through open ends is a huge time suck, right? Like, and if you can use it, even say, hey, these are the ones that are bad, and you can kind of go and review it, like that saves at least probably 50% of the time that you would spend on analyzing those things. So you can get that 250 hours down maybe a little bit, from the year.
Hopefully.
So one question before we wrap up is, kind of talked about that it's, kind of an emerging technology right now, largely, kind of adopted in the past 6 months or so. Where do you see it going in the next 6 months to a year? And what are you hoping, I guess maybe a better way to frame it is, what are you hoping that it can do to kind of help alleviate some of that, the time that you're spending on open-ended data?
So I think this might still be a dream, and maybe this is not a 1 year thing, and it's not going to be my next project. Like this is way beyond my GPT skills here. But I think what would be really cool is so GPT understands context, right? And it also has access to facts, like in the outside world, external world. So if we go back to this data cohesion, then there has to be a way to train it so that it picks up on the inconsistencies in the quant data.
Oh, interesting.
So it knows that students shouldn't be making $100,000 because I'm sure there's statistics out there about, what's the average salary of a student, right?
Interesting. Yep.
Yeah. So then if we have this, this model basically compute a score based on all of the inconsistencies that it picks up on at a respondent level, then we could decide, okay, well, that's just, there's so many things that are crazy about this person. Let's just screen them out in the survey, right? Using a QA redirect. Or it seems a bit weird, but I'll have a look at it. And then the model could also tell you what contributed to the score, right? Like, here's the link to why students should not be making $100,000. Now you can go and make the decision for yourself. So I think this sounds like a possible use case. It sounds very challenging to actually design this thing. So it's not going to be me, but if anyone out there wants to have a shot at it, I'd love to test it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So not so much, not open-ended data, but more closed-ended and checking it against a few different, I'll call them variables in the survey to make sure, hey, does this match up? Does this not? Interesting. I actually love that because it does solve a big problem, I think, and kind of goes back to what we're talking about at the beginning of the conversation with around, hey, does this one respondent in the data set make sense? And you could easily get a yes or no without having to analyze all those responses. So
yeah, there are certain things that we can do if it's like really obvious sort of check that you can build into the script or build, SPSS, whatever. But the benefit of AI is that it should know a lot more than you do. You don't think about all the relationships between all of your questions and the type of person who answered the survey and all that. So this is where I think AI comes in, because it can analyze all these relationships based on what it knows about everything else in the world.
Right. No, that's amazing. Well, Karine, I loved our conversation today. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll have to do a round 2 at some point because I know you got more to share. So we'll do it again.
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Appreciate you coming on.
Bye.
Bye.